If you look at an X-ray of a broken arm, there's a very comforting certainty to it. You see that jagged white line on the film, the doctor points to it, and boom, you have your diagnosis.
Right, it's very straightforward.
Yes, it's basically a mechanical failure. You set the bone, put on a cast, and it heals. We really love that kind of precision. We want the world to be visible, categorized, and just, well, solvable.
But then you zoom out. You leave the doctor's office and you step into the vast, totally chaotic landscape of human history. Suddenly, that X-ray machine is just useless.
Yeah, totally useless.
Because when you are looking at the diagnostic chart of how entire civilizations live, peak, and ultimately collapse, you are staring into the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
Right.
A society isn't a single organism with a single skeleton. It is millions of moving parts. Ideologies, supply chains, power struggles.
Which makes diagnosing the death of an empire incredibly difficult. And that is exactly what we are exploring today. Welcome, the learner, to your custom-tailored deep dive. We know you're here because you want to grasp big, complex ideas without drowning in information overload.
You want the signal, not the noise.
Exactly. Today, our mission is to answer one towering, terrifying question. Why do civilizations end?
It is a question that has haunted every major power in human history, usually right around the moment they start believing they are invincible.
To tackle this, we are looking at a wildly diverse stack of sources. I mean, we are jumping from a highly controversial 1970s French novel to the British gunboats of the Opium Wars, all the way down into the cold, hard mathematics of natural selection. Okay, let's unpack this. Our first source takes us into the realm of speculative fiction. Specifically, a 1973 novel by French author Jean Raspail called The Camp of the Saints.
Before we delve into the plot, we need to be crystal clear about the context of this book. It is heavily criticized and widely condemned as racist, xenophobic, and dehumanizing.
Yeah, it's a very charged text.
Very. Concurrently, it has become a foundational text for modern far-right movements and the Great Replacement theory, which is the belief that white European populations are being demographically and culturally replaced by non-white peoples.
And we should state right here, we're not here to take a side, endorse these viewpoints, or debate the politics. We're simply unpacking the source material impartially to examine its central mechanical thesis about why societies collapse.
Exactly. We're looking purely at the blueprint of his argument. So the plot of the novel revolves around an impoverished multitude, which the book calls the Last Chance Armada. They board a fleet of dilapidated cargo ships on the Ganges in India and sail toward the French Côte d'Azur.
And the core tension in the book is that this armada has no weapons.
Right.
It is not a military invasion.
Right, and that lack of weaponry is the crux of Raspail's thesis. He argues that the West doesn't collapse because it gets overpowered by an external military force. It collapses because of internal moral paralysis.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, as this fleet approaches the coast of France, Western politicians, journalists, and religious leaders find themselves completely paralyzed by ideological guilt and, humanitarian impulses. They view the incoming armada through the lens of universal brotherhood, completely unable to make hard, defensive decisions.
Wait, so the military actually abandons its posts because the soldiers lack the civilizational will to use lethal force against an unarmed, desperate people?
Precisely. The local population flees in a panic. Raspail is basically arguing that a civilization's primary vulnerability is psychological weakness and a loss of cultural conviction.
So his thesis suggests that universalist morality and extreme humanitarianism eventually warp into self-destructive dogmas.
Yeah. In the narrative of the novel, the West falls in a matter of days. It doesn't fall to artillery. It falls because it allows itself to be demographically overwhelmed out of a misplaced sense of pity.
But when we step out of speculative fiction and look at the actual historical reality of how civilizational invasions have operated, the contrast is staggering. Raspail writes about a wealthy host nation being paralyzed by guilt while a desperate, impoverished population seeks basic survival. If we look at the 19th century Western subjugation of Qing Dynasty China, we see the exact opposite dynamic.
It is a perfect historical inversion. In 19th century China, you didn't have unarmed, starving migrants washing up on the shores. You had highly organized, state-directed military expeditions. The British, and later the French, deployed steam-powered gunboats and rifled muskets against a largely agrarian empire of over 400 million people.
And those British expeditions weren't driven by survival or demographic pressure back in London.
Right.
They were driven by aggressive, calculated economic extractivism. The British Empire had a massive trade deficit in silver because they had an insatiable appetite for Chinese tea. And the king court only accepted silver. So to balance their checkbook, the British fought the First Opium War to force China to legalize British-grown Indian opium.
That's incredible.
Yeah, they used state violence to push narcotics on another civilization just to flip a trade deficit.
Notice the stark difference in the ideological framing here compared to the novel. In Raspel's book, the invading force relies on the host nation's moral self-doubt. In historical reality, the British operated with absolute, unshakable ideological certainty.
They didn't feel a shred of guilt.
None at all. They believed they were bringing progress, modernity, and free trade to a stagnant, backward empire. They felt completely justified by their so-called civilizing mission.
They didn't just invade either, they legalized their dominance. They forced the king court to sign the Treaty of Nanking, which institutionalized British power. It initiated a century of spheres of influence, extraterritorial rights, and crushing financial indemnity.
Yeah, a total systematic dismantling.
But what I find profoundly ironic here is the historical fear of the Yellow Peril. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, the West was terrified that China's vast population would eventually spill over and overwhelm Western civilization. Raspel's novel takes that exact fear of being demographically swamped, but projects it onto the very populations that the West had historically colonized and subjugated.
It really highlights a fascinating psychological projection. And the language Raspel uses is crucial. The novel treats the migrants as a pathogen overwhelming a host body that has lost its immune system.
Which provides a seamless transition to our next source. Raspel isn't the only one who views society through the lens of a biological organism fighting a disease. Historians and anti-colonial thinkers have used that exact same pathological metaphor, but they aim it at entirely different targets.
Let's look at Crane Brinton's classic 1938 book, The Anatomy of Revolution. Brinton analyzed the English, American, French, and Russian revolutions, and he concluded that a revolution functions like a fever infecting a society.
I really love this framing because you can actually map the symptoms of the society just like a patient in a hospital bed.
You really can. Brinton breaks the disease progression into 4 stages. First is the incubation period. Interestingly, this phase isn't usually characterized by absolute grinding poverty. It's characterized by economic strain on the rising, capable classes.
So imagine merchants or lawyers who have money but feel entirely blocked from political power by outdated aristocratic institutions.
Exactly. The government goes bankrupt, intellectuals start deserting the ruling order, and the state loses confidence in its own legitimacy. The society is infected, but the fever hasn't spiked yet.
Then we hit the second stage, which is moderate rule. The old regime collapses, and usually it happens surprisingly easily. Moderates take over, trying to implement gradual, sensible reforms.
But they get caught in a vice grip.
Right, between reactionaries on the right who want the king back and radicals on the left who want to burn the whole system down.
Right.
And the moderates just fail to maintain order.
Which triggers the third stage, the radical crisis. This is the delirium phase of the fever. The moderates are swept aside and extremists seize power. Think of the Jacobins during the French Revolution or the Bolsheviks in Russia.
It gets violent fast.
Very. What's crucial to understand is that these radical groups are highly disciplined, organized minorities. They initiate a reign of terror to purge their enemies, driven by an intense, almost religious puritanism to fundamentally remake human nature.
Until the patient either dies or the fever finally breaks. Stage 4, Thermidor.
Named after the month in the French Revolutionary calendar when the radical leader Robespierre was finally overthrown, the society is simply exhausted by the relentless terror and paranoia. People just want basic stability and normalcy again.
So a strongman inevitably steps in to restore order.
Yeah, someone like Oliver Cromwell, Napoleon Bonaparte, or Joseph Stalin. The society retains some big structural changes from the revolution, like land redistribution, but the radical, utopian social experiments are tossed out.
Though we should know the American Revolution is the big exception to Britain's model. It had the incubation and the moderate phase, but largely skipped that delirious radical terror phase.
That's a good point.
Now, sticking with this biological metaphor, anti-colonial thinkers took this idea of a societal disease and mapped it onto imperialism. They argued colonialism wasn't just an unfair political policy, it functioned as a literal parasite.
The comparison to biological parasitism is striking. A parasite extracts vital resources from a host without offering any reciprocal contribution. Historically, economists called this the drain of wealth. You see it in the Davai Naroji's analysis of British India, or King Leopold extracting wild rubber and ivory from the Congo. It was a systemic siphoning of vitality from the periphery to the imperial center.
And a successful parasite also suppresses the host's immune system, so the host can't fight back, right? How does that translate to geopolitics?
In colonial terms, immune suppression meant eroding indigenous governance and deliberately deindustrializing native manufacturing.
Oh, wow.
For example, Bengal had a thriving, globally competitive textile sector. The British intentionally dismantled it through tariffs and policies, forcing the local population to export raw cotton and buy back finished textiles from British mills in Lancashire.
It even goes down to cellular reprogramming. The colonial powers rewired the host's machinery by converting diverse local food crops into export cash crops, like indigo, sugar, and opium.
Right, changing the very fabric of the agriculture.
They built vast railway networks, but not to connect local communities to each other. The tracks were designed purely to extract goods from the interior to the coastal ports. And all of this was masked by what you could call ideological anesthesia. That civilizing mission we talked about earlier, which numbed the host into thinking the extraction was actually moral uplift.
The Martinican philosopher Aimé Césaire took this even further with his concept of the boomerang effect. He argued that colonialism was a rot that eventually returned to infect Europe from within. The brutal, dehumanizing tactics practiced overseas inevitably came back to brutalize the colonizer's own domestic society.
That's chilling.
And of course, there is Alfred Crosby's concept of ecological imperialism, where the pathogens weren't metaphors at all. Old world diseases like smallpox wiped out 80 to 90% of indigenous populations in the Americas.
Okay, but I have to push back here on the framing. There is a real danger in relying on these metaphors. If we reduce human beings or complex political systems to viruses or parasites or pathogens, aren't we stripping away all human agency? It feels like we are entering a highly dangerous, dehumanizing territory. Because if you view your political opponent as a parasite, you don't have to debate them, you just have to eradicate them.
That is a vital critique. Whenever you label a group a parasite or an invader, you are inherently playing a moral blame game. It obscures historical nuances, like the fact that local elites often actively collaborated with colonial powers for their own gain.
Right, it's rarely that black and white.
It reduces history to a simplistic comic book narrative of pure good versus pure evil. To truly understand why societies clash and why civilizations end, we have to strip away the moralizing entirely. We have to look at the raw underlying mechanics of human nature, which brings us to political realism.
Right, the idea that history isn't a courtroom trial where the most moral side wins. It's a structural competition for finite resources.
Go back to the ancient Greek historian Thucydides and his famous Melian dialogue. The Athenians laid out the rules of international relations bluntly to the weaker Melians. They said, the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must.
Brutal.
From the Romans to the Mongols to the Aztecs, civilizations don't expand because they're uniquely malevolent. They expand simply because they possess the capability to do so.
It's the ultimate predator and prey dynamic. And evolutionary game theory actually models this mathematically with the hawk-dove problem. If you have a population where everyone plays the dove strategy, they share resources peacefully and avoid conflict. But the second one, aggressive hawk, mutates or enters the population, it completely dominates. The hawk takes all the food because the doves always back down to avoid a fight.
However, a population entirely made up of hawks is equally doomed. If every interaction escalates into a fight to the death, the hawks destroy themselves through constant attrition, so nature finds a balance. It discovers an equilibrium where a certain ratio of hawks and doves keeps the population stable.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. When I look at those models, my first thought is humans do not play by neat, spreadsheet-style game theory rules. We are messy. We are deeply irrational. We start wars out of spite or pride or some religious delusion. We don't sit down at a negotiating table, calculate the Nash equilibria, that theoretical sweet spot where no one benefits by changing their strategy, and then act perfectly rationally.
We don't calculate it consciously, no. But the math of natural selection doesn't require you to carry a calculator. Nature enforces the math through survival. Evolutionary psychologists argue that our most seemingly irrational, violent emotions are actually hard-coded game strategies that evolve specifically to ensure our survival.
Wait, walk me through that.
Yeah.
How could something as destructive as vengeance be considered a rational survival strategy?
Vengeance functions as highly credible deterrence. Think about it. If a rival tribe knows you are willing to suffer massive irrational damage just to hurt them back, even if it ruins you economically or physically, they are far less likely to prey on you in the first place.
Oh, wow. So even if the act of revenge destroys me in the moment, the simple fact that I possess the instinct for vengeance protects my group in the long run.
Precisely. What about pride? In a lawless, prehistoric environment, pride acts as prestige signaling. Cultivating an explosive, disproportionate reputation for honor prevents predators from encroaching on your territory, saving you from having to fight every single day.
That makes total sense.
Even altruism and guilt, which seem like weaknesses, function as enforcement mechanisms for reciprocity. They keep the tribe cohesive and prevent individuals from exploiting each other.
So our raw emotions are essentially the software nature installed in our brains to make us play the game theory optimally without having to think about it. But this pure predator model has to have limits, right? I mean, human history isn't just constant, unending plundering.
It absolutely has limits. Purely abstractive empires eventually hit structural ceilings. Take the early Spanish Empire, hoarding massive amounts of New World silver. Eventually, they suffered crippling inflation, and the sheer cost of maintaining global military garrisons outpaced the loot they were bringing in. Humans actually survive long-term through positive-sum cooperation.
We build trade networks, international law, non-proliferation treaties. We actively construct institutions to make conquest legally illegitimate and economically punishing.
We have to build those institutions because the old economic myth of Homo economicus, the perfectly rational utility-maximizing actor, fails in the real world.
Why is that?
It fails because of the security dilemma. Imagine two peaceful nations. One builds a defensive wall just to feel safe. The neighboring nation sees the wall, gets paranoid that it's a staging ground for an invasion, and attacks preemptively. Add in ideological delusions or selfish elites who start foreign wars just to distract from domestic failures, and you see why we need global institutions to curb our worst predatory instincts.
We used our big brains and our capacity for massive cooperation to successfully break out of this brutal natural predator-prey cycle. We basically beat the game.
This raises an important question, though. What if winning the game of nature leads to the most dangerous trap of all?
You're talking about the ecological trap.
Yes, we have to examine the Malthusian carrying capacity. What happens to a species when it completely eliminates its natural predators?
It overpopulates.
Exactly. Take the famous ecological case of the reindeer introduced to St. Matthew Island in the Bering Sea. Without any wolves or bears to hunt them, their population exploded exponentially. They ate all the lichen on the island, totally decimating their baseline food supply, and then experienced a catastrophic, massive population crash. Predation, as brutal as it is, acts as a negative feedback loop that maintains a healthy equilibrium.
But humanity broke all those rules. We used technology to artificially defeat our predators. We developed modern medicine to defeat pathogens. We invented the Haber-Bosch process, literally figuring out how to pull nitrogen directly out of the air to create synthetic fertilizer, which shattered the natural biological limits on food production.
It changed everything.
We built global supply chains to ensure that local resource scarcity doesn't cause a localized famine.
We took a localized zero-sum game with nature and turned it into a massive global project of continuous expansion. But in doing so, we removed the natural checks on our own system. And this brings us to the ultimate, unavoidable historical reality. 100% of civilizations have a terminal point.
Wait, 100%? Nobody escapes the crash?
Nobody. They all hit limits. And systems theorists point to three primary mechanisms for why this happens. First is Joseph Tainter's theory of diminishing returns on complexity. To solve societal problems, societies add layers of bureaucracy, specialized laws, and infrastructure.
Which usually helps at first.
Initially, this works brilliantly, but eventually, the sheer cost of maintaining that massive administrative overhead requires more energy than the system produces. When a crisis hits, the society has zero margin left, and it collapses under its own weight.
It's like adding so many new memory-heavy features to a smartphone app that the phone's battery just drains in 5 minutes. Okay, so complexity gets too expensive. But what about the people running the system? Don't the leaders see the crash coming and try to fix it?
That leads to the second limit: Institutional rigidity, championed by Peter Turchin. Over time, institutions get captured by entrenched elites. You get a phenomenon called elite overproduction, where you have too many wealthy, highly educated people vying for a fixed number of political seats or power positions.
So they start fighting each other for those limited spots.
Yes, and to win those internal fights, elite factions start mobilizing the lower classes against each other. It leads to extreme polarization, gridlock, and eventually factional civil wars. The society loses its ability to adapt even when everyone can clearly see the crisis approaching.
And the third limit is just raw physics, right? Biophysical limits.
Every single civilization requires a continuous energy surplus, whether that energy comes from burning wood, harvesting grain, or extracting fossil fuels. When you erode your thermodynamic base through topsoil degradation, deforestation, or depleting accessible energy reserves, the physical system has to contract.
That sounds incredibly grim.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, a terminal point doesn't necessarily mean everyone dies in an apocalyptic extinction event.
Oh, that is a relief. So what does the terminal point actually look like on the ground?
History shows two primary paths when a civilization hits its limit. The first is systemic fracture. The political and economic superstructure collapses rapidly. Think of the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The vast, interconnected Mediterranean trade networks severed. Centralized tax collection ended, literacy declined, and monumental architecture starved.
But the people didn't just vanish.
No, the local population survived and reorganized at a much simpler, localized agrarian scale.
So the complex machine breaks into 100 smaller, simpler pieces. What's the second path?
Cultural metamorphosis. The overarching political regime ends, but its core systems are absorbed and restructured. Think of imperial Qing China. The dynastic system that had ruled for millennia finally dissolved under internal and external pressures. But the civilization itself didn't fracture into localized fiefdoms like Rome did. It underwent a massive, painful transformation, evolving its cultural operating system into the modern Chinese nation-state.
I really love that analogy. Human culture isn't a biological organism that is genetically programmed to senesce and die at a certain age. It's adaptive software. We've hit absolute boundaries before, like the physical limits of pre-industrial agriculture, and we wrote a massive software update. We discovered fossil fuels and created new social contracts. A society's lifespan really only ends when its mounting problems finally outpace its willingness to adapt.
Which is the exact tension we face today. Nature will always enforce a correction if a system overshoots its carrying capacity. The choice we have is whether we manage that correction ourselves through institutional discipline and technological innovation, or wait for the brutal mechanics of the predator-prey cycle to reassert themselves through ecological collapse and resource wars.
So what does this all mean for you? We've journeyed from fictional fears of demographic collapse to the aggressive reality of historical imperialism. We've looked at how societies get sick like a fever, how our most irrational emotions are actually hard-coded survival math, and how our absolute technological success has pushed us right to the edge of our ecological limits.
It serves as a stark reminder that the fundamental rules of the game haven't changed, even if our technology makes us feel invincible.
And that leaves us with one final thought to mull over. If previous civilizations hit their terminal points and fractured into smaller pieces, like Rome falling back into localized kingdoms, what happens to our civilization now? We have built global supply chains that have turned the entire planet into a single interconnected thermodynamic system. If we hit our global carrying capacity today, is a localized fracture even physically possible anymore? Or does a planetary system demand a planetary metamorphosis? Think on that. Thank you for bringing these brilliant sources to the table, learner, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.